Good morning. Such a pleasure to be here with all of you, and it's really my great honor to return to Yale 10 years after I left as a fellow at the Institute for Sacred Music. And so I had to go walk by my old apartment and take a tour through the Divinity School and snap some pictures, send them home to my wife. Just a real pleasure to be here and to see all of you interact, and I've enjoyed the conversations we've had so thoroughly over the past couple of days. And now, we're on the final day of this conference, and I have the pleasure of introducing our speakers, after which they will each speak for roughly 15 minutes, and then we'll have some time for robust Q&A and discussion. Our first presenter this morning is Dr. Rhon Manigault-Bryant. You swapped it? Okay. First presenter this morning is Dr. Michael E. Veal. Michael Veal is the Henry L. and Lucy G. Moses Professor of Ethnomusicology in the Department of Music at Yale University. He is the author of several books. And I have to tell you that the little bio that he sent me, and this is probably true for both of them, whether they send them to me or they're online, they don't do justice to the full range of accomplishments and service that they've done. And I want to salute both of them for their modesty and for their influence on my own career as well. Getting back to the bios, Michael Veal is the author of several books, including Fela, The Life and Times of an African Musical Icon, Dub, Soundscapes and Shattered Songs in Jamaican Reggae. And by the way, that last volume, the Dub book, it was reviewed by several people. Paul Gilroy noted that Veal's wise volume has rescued reggae music at last from the tentacles of exoticism. This is a glorious affirmation of Dub's rebel Creole spirit. He's currently just finished a third monograph, which is titled Living Space, John Coltrane, Miles Davis, and Free Jazz, From Analog to Digital. And we can look forward to that later this year. And like me, Michael Veal is also a scholar performer. He's an electric bassist, saxophonist, and leads his own group called the Afrobeat Jazz Band, Michael Veal and Aqua Life. It's my pleasure. Aqua Ife. Oh, I saw an L in there. And currently based in New York and contributing to both musical and scholarly communities. The second presenter this morning will be Dr. Rhon Manigault-Bryant, who serves as the director, the new director, I understand, as of January this year, of the Sonia Haynes Stone She's the Sonia Haynes Stone Director for Black Culture and History and Professor of African American and Diaspora Studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And this comes after over a decade, maybe 15 years or so, at Williams College in Massachusetts. She's a proud native of Moncks Corner, South Carolina, and she wholly and critically grapples with the profound questions that inform our understandings of gender, race, culture, and religious expression, evident in her book, Talking to the Dead, Religion, Music, and Lived Memory Among Gullah Geechee Women, and her award-winning documentary short, Death, Everything, Nothing, in 2020. Whether investigating practices of specific communities, exploring cultural production at the popular level, considering the impact of new technologies, or creating documentary shorts, critical to Dr. Manigault-Bryant's research and teaching are explorations of how Black women throughout the diaspora engage religion and spirituality to navigate the contours of life. Please join me in welcoming Michael Veal, followed by Dr. Manigault-Bryant.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Can you all hear me? Yes. Great. All right. Now, I've tried to do the right thing and adhere to our 15-minute limit, so I'm going to jump right into it. This is an excerpt from, this presentation excerpts ideas from my forthcoming book, which is called Living Space, as Melvin just introduced. That unfortunately, you're losing a lot of the cover information just because there's so much light in here. Dark cover. But that's the cover of the book, and it should be out later this year, or maybe early 2024. The book has actually been finished for a year and is currently in production, but the pandemic has slowed down all of the supply chain. Oh, great, thank you. Has slowed down all of the supply chains for the publishers, and so books are kind of dragging behind schedule. I worked on this project for about 15 years, and I have since moved on to other projects. So this is probably the last presentation that I'll give on this material. And, thank God for that, because it's been a long slog. And in a way, it's coming full circle with the first presentation I ever gave on this material, which also happened to be at Yale. And I'm not going to say any more about that now, but that'll become clear later in the paper exactly how it's coming full circle. So what I'm going to do this morning is to draw on the first half of the book, which is an extended essay about the final 2 years of John Coltrane's career. In other words, from late 1964, when he recorded the canonical Love Supreme, until the end of his life and career in the summer of 1967. Now, somehow the phrase transformations of sonic consciousness stuck in my head as a theme for today's panel. I don't know, I thought it was on the official literature or something, but then when I went through everything, I saw that it was nowhere to be found. But I'm just going to stick with that because I think it is resonant with a number of the themes that have been explored over the course of the week. Transformations of sonic consciousness. Now, when we speak of transformations of sonic consciousness, there are many ways that that formulation can be interpreted because, of course, there are many different modes of consciousness itself. For the record, this book also addresses political consciousness, historical consciousness, cultural consciousness, but the mode of sonic consciousness that I'm addressing today, we might refer to as celestial consciousness. Because during these final 2 years of Coltrane's career, the goal of his music was really to facilitate the listener's awareness of and access to an experience of what we might define as a heavenly state of consciousness, let's say. And we can see this very clearly in the song titles and album titles of his music in this period, such as Ascension from June of 1965, Sonship from August of 1965, Stellar Regions from February of 1967, Interstellar Space from February, March of 1967. So you see, everything is directing our attention upwards. So what I'm going to try to do this morning is explore the ways that Coltrane manipulated the sound world of jazz to achieve this celestial mode of consciousness. Let me give you some biographical background to focus this idea of the celestial. John Coltrane was born in 1926 in North Carolina and had been raised in a very religious Southern Christian household, Baptist to be precise. Both his father and his grandfather were Baptist preachers. So images of heaven and the sky, an exalted place up there, a higher dimension of consciousness, upward directionality, etc., take your pick, they loom large in his consciousness. Now, this heavenly orientation is the reason that there's so many images of Coltrane with his eyes turned towards the skies, like this, for example, or even a slightly more ponderous image like this. Now, I'm emphasizing this because jazz, as a music that was historically a dance music, also has some very earthy qualities to it, especially the way Coltrane's original quartet played. Here's a quote from the producer and archivist, Michael Kuskuna. Quote, "Over the course of 50 years of hearing plenty of live music, nothing I've experienced has surpassed the many occasions on which I was lucky enough to hear the John Coltrane Quartet. These men would take us to a place that was as deep in spirituality as it was charged with sexual energy. For me, nothing has come close to what they achieved nightly." Now, I don't think that John Coltrane himself would have described his music. The erotic wouldn't have been a point of thematic reference for Coltrane, but the point is, On the reception side, this is what this producer and probably many other people were hearing in the music. So let's just listen to an excerpt. Okay, so you can already hear there in the construction of the music, the way he's playing, he's trying to pull the listener up with those rhythmic figures. I mean, I don't know how you all are hearing it. You know, we have to put ourselves in the mindset and the sound world of 1965 when this music was kind of still in dialogue with jazz as dance music. Today, it's like an art music. It's very abstract. We hear it in very abstract terms. In 1965, you know, everyone would have, it was equally a body music. And someone out there was snapping their fingers. So someone could still feel it, you know, from the standpoint of the whole body and not just the brain. In any case, now as a sidebar, I'm going to acknowledge the fact that despite being raised Christian, Coltrane was, or rather became, emblematic of a certain stream of jazz musicians and Americans in general of the 1960s who came to understand their spiritual practice or their spiritual quest in more global, cross-cultural terms, whether that meant embracing at different times Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, not to mention the various West African spiritual systems and their offshoots in the Afro-Caribbean and the African diaspora. Now, I mention this because not all spiritual systems seek transcendence in the sky. Some seek it in the elements of the earth, for example. But Coltrane, who had been born into a Christian orientation, sought it in the sky, even despite, as the producer Michael Kuskuna depicted, the earthiness and the visceral qualities of his particular artistic medium. This is all clear so far? All right. Now, let me add that the celestial consciousness in Coltrane's music was buttressed by two additional narratives. One is the medieval science of astrology, which made a big comeback in the 1960s. Many of Coltrane's song titles gestured towards the astrological discourse via the names of planets, constellations, star systems, etc. Leo, Mars, Saturn, Jupiter, Venus, Equinox, and other song titles. And the second relevant discourse was the space race, which, of course, we're now in the 1960s at the height of NASA and the US space program and the Apollo launches, and we're only 2 years away from the Apollo 11 moon landing. So the space race and its popular culture offshoot, science fiction. So the popular culture of the time was full of images of space vessels escaping earthly gravity and ascending into the clouds. And most significantly for our purpose, the popular culture and entertainment of that time was full of images of flotation. So here, for example, the space shuttle astronauts in zero gravity, and there are many photos of the Apollo astronauts floating around in the lunar modules, etc. So whether we're talking about Star Trek, the first generation, or Lost in Space, or the Jetsons, or all those 60s television series and movies, flotation was a pervasive sensation in the cultural consciousness of the space race 1960s. So, that is the first way that Coltrane, wait, have I missed something here? Something's missing from my presentation, sorry. Let me reword that sentence. So the first way that Coltrane got us oriented toward the stars was by replacing a sense of steady, metered rhythm with a sense of flotation. In other words, moving away from this kind of syntax that you could snap your fingers to, that you could tap your feet to, that you could dance to, that you could count 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. That's what we call meter. So by deconstructing a sense of repetitive meter and giving the music a quality of flotation, this is one way that he directed our attention upwards. This is from June 1965. Okay, so could you all hear the difference between those two pieces? The first one is in the pocket, as they say, and the second one feels like, it's very difficult to find a consistent point of rhythmic orientation. You can find it here and there for brief stretches, but it's always shifting. So by deconstructing a solid sense of meter, that's one way that he's affecting our nervous system this way, kind of lifting us up. Does that all make sense so far? Okay, so that's the first way. Now the second way, actually, before I explain the second way, I'll just like to tell you that unfortunately we have a criminal in the proceedings today, and so I would just like to put his photo on the screen. So if you see this person, make sure you call 911, report him to the police. If you happen to see this guy, hopefully you have your mobile phones handy. Now, the reason I'm putting this photo on the screen is actually to acknowledge Professor Melvin Butler, because, and this is what I meant by bringing everything full circle. When I first presented this work at Yale, Melvin was a fellow at the ISM, and let me move back just a second. I want to give you the right perspective here. Now, what you're going to see here is an animation that I put together with an architect in Hamburg, Germany, and it shows a process of rhythmic reconstruction. It just shows a cube rotating cyclically, a completely symmetric cube rotating. And then you're going to see the cube exploded into fragments, and then you're going to see the fragments reconsolidate into a new state. And this is a metaphor for these different stages of rhythm. this is a little abstract, but I think you all will see where I'm going with this. You have this completely symmetric cube. Sorry, the resolutions are not great. Circling around cyclically. And then it's exploded into fragments. But when we reassert gravity, the fragments reconsolidate, but they don't reconsolidate into the cube form. They reconsolidate into this thing, which is called spline form, actually. So the reason that Melvin is relevant to this, you don't mind me moving away from the mic, this feels a little constricted back there. The reason that Melvin is relevant is because when he saw this back in whatever it was, 2014, he posed a question, which really put me on the spot that day. And he asked me, well, I understand what you're saying in terms of rhythm, but what is the pitch corollary to this? Remember that? I don't. Okay. Well, he doesn't remember, but I've been agonizing it over there. So, but that is a very important question, because this music is not only comprised of rhythms, it's comprised of pitches, and as much as we might try, we can't detach rhythmic information and pitch information from each other, right? We can't totally detach those parameters from each other. They both have their respective gravities, and those gravities interact, interlock, intersect. Now, I want to give you all a provisional apology. I'm almost finished. Because I have to go a little bit into the zone of music theory now, and I don't know how many of you are comfortable with technical musical terminology now. It's not really fashionable or sexy to be getting into musical terminology these days. There's a whole battle being fought in the field of music theory about the place of formalist analysis and technical terms and who, it's racialized and it's gendered and blah, blah, blah. So the thing I'll say is, if you don't understand what I'm explaining in literal terms, don't worry about it, because you can just flow with the rhetorical slopes of what I'm saying. In other words, the technical terminology is nothing but a set of images anyway, so you can just hear it as poetry that happens to relate to music. And you can consider this advanced work in the reorientation of music theory. In any case, so thinking about Melvin's challenge to me that day, I realized that the second technique for lifting us up into the heavens, so to speak, is a different kind of deconstruction, which is the deconstruction of tonality. Coltrane began to deconstruct tonality in 1959 with his canonical piece, Giant Steps. Giant Steps is a tonal piece, but in the way that it splits up the octave into symmetric regions, it begins to move towards lack of tonality. Now, if you don't understand what I mean by that, all you need to focus on is the term symmetry. In order for us to experience gravity in harmony, there needs to be a sense of tension and release. Within this tension and release, some pitches are stronger than others, and the strongest pitch to which everything resolves is the tonal center or the key center, however you want to describe it. So the question becomes, oh, I see what happened here. My pages got mixed up. When you're dealing with certain symmetric pitch relationships, you've given all the pitches equal weight. In other words, there's no more gravity in the same way. There's no sense of a tonal center. Now, in Coltrane's music, the whole tone scale is a really important tool in this regard. You can actually divide the octave into two whole tone scales. Now, the whole tone scale is a 6-note scale in which all the pitches are separated by whole steps. The point is, since it's completely symmetrical, all the pitches have equal weight, and as such, there's no feeling of a tonal center as such. And the whole tone scale is known for its unsettled feeling, its kind of floating feeling. It's not the only symmetric scale, but it's one of the most important symmetric scales. Now, this is one of the most important material artifacts of John Coltrane. It's a so-called Coltrane tone circle. And this diagram, I don't know if you can see it. It's again, not the best resolution, but this is all we have. Coltrane drew this. This is his own hand. And you see the outer concentric rings here depict two whole tones, the two whole tone scales. Now, he's doing a number of other things with this diagram, but we won't get into that. For our purposes, let's just say that this diagram is significant in that it demonstrates the centrality of the whole tone scale to Coltrane's music. Now, visually, I'd like you to note that the division of this into 12 regions correlates with the 12 houses of the zodiac and astrology. So in one way of thinking, we can read this to say that Coltrane used this diagram to display his harmonic equation for levitation. Now, the beautiful thing about this mode of harmonic thinking is that you're not shackled to a particular key. You can just keep gliding across different key centers. You're going to hear a lot more than whole tone scales in this and augmented chords in this next example. But the point is that the types of chords generated from this are used as pivot points so that the music feels like it's continually moving through keys and across tonal centers and key centers. Okay, so you all get the idea of where I'm going with this? If we were to go in and analyze this, we see that these whole tone scales, these augmented chords are used to continuously redirect the music. So some people find it to be a very liberating feeling, and other people find it to be a very unsettling and disturbing feeling, whether we're deconstructing meter or whether we're deconstructing tonality, because those are the reference points that most people use to orient themselves within the musical experience. And it's interesting to note, and this is where the book goes off into political territory, that historically, in the development of Western music and Western harmony, the use of symmetric scales like the whole tone scales and the diminished scale, it was very, very tightly regulated because it was considered to be, if it was wrongly used, it was considered considered a catalyst for diabolical feelings within the human, that we have to be very careful about these symmetric scales because they arouse the devilish nature of the human being. There are even chords like the diminished chords, which were stereotyped as the devil's chord because of the feeling that it creates in the human organism. And so what's interesting about that from a political standpoint is Coltrane, as an African American who had reached back into some of the African traditions and other world music traditions, was using precisely that feeling to create a sense of liberation with his music and levitation. So spiritual levitation and political liberation encoded into the manipulation of those unsettling harmonies that create a feeling of flotation. I don't want to take up too much time. I feel like I've gone over my 15 minutes. I will just say that these two techniques, the deconstruction of meter, repetitive meter, cyclical meter, and the deconstruction of tonality are the two techniques through which Coltrane and his musicians took us to the stars, and in fact, John Coltrane himself transcended this plane a mere 3 or 4 months after this last recording. So in a way, this was also how Coltrane himself opened a portal for his own transition from this plane. I guess I'll stop here, but there's a lot more in the book, so I encourage you all in 2028, 29, whenever the book is available, to go out and, if you still remember by that point, to get a copy. Thank you so much.
Good morning. All right. Salve. I inherited a cemetery. I learned about that inheritance during a call from my great-aunt Peggy, days after her husband's sudden death. It turns out that her husband, my great-uncle Booker, had jotted my name on a note on the back of one of his land survey documents. Aunt Peggy knew that Booker's passing meant that someone had to fill the role of tending to the family's land, just as he did. She discerned, however, that my name on his note, on that particular page, meant that it was meant to be me. By my birth into the Manigault family, my paternal family, I always had rights to be interred into that cemetery, our cemetery. But by Uncle Booker's death, I earned rights to be its caretaker. In that role, I am called to heal familiar wounds, to soothe generational fissures. Sound. You have not been properly awakened from your sleep until you have been cajoled by the community bell. My hometown, Moncks Corner, is small, 7,000 people. In my neighborhood, Kitfield, even smaller. Those of us at the bottom, the land area beyond the big curve on Kitfield Road, were tight-knit, as many Black Southern rural communities were and are. We were united in geography and location, by class and by baseball and softball, and we were united by the big red bell, the same bell that now adorns the entrance to my family's cemetery, which you can see in the far right corner of the image. My earliest memories of that bell ringing were when new babies came and people got married, but my most powerful memories were when the bell tolled to tell us someone died. Often in the middle of the night, being awakened by the bell told us that we needed to communicate with each other. Who died? Who needs help? Who needs food? Who needs money? Who is now mourning? The tolling of the community bell was a signal that ignited community response of grief, support, and ritual. It is a reminder that some of our most powerful memories of death have everything to do with its signaling. Sent. My mother is dead, but I am not unmothered. A note from a kind colleague 2 days after my New York Times op-ed about Gwen, about her demise in the midst of the pandemic, signed, and I quote, "with particular light and gentleness," end quote, gave way to a card and an email exchange that included a link to Ruth Margolit's essay, The Unmothered, also published in the New York Times nearly 6 years prior to that day. My colleague Ashley is a good human being. She meant no offense or no harm. She wanted to convey that she understood, at least relationally, because she too had lost her mother, or had become unmothered, as it were. And yet, I was immediately offended by this Eurocentric Western way of creating false dichotomies. In the Black diaspora, in my communities, in Moncks Corner, the dead are present, are active. We talk to them and seek them. On occasion, we see them, and we often smell them. My mother's scent is surprising in its frequency when I cook cabbage or catch a whiff of a Newport cigarette, or more frequently when I steam rice. Each time I become stricken with nostalgia and longing. The dead are not dead. So no, Ashley, I am neither motherless nor unmothered. We would be wise to accept ancestral presence rather than deny them. Sight. I sat straight up when death came. While this may sound like a provocative line out of a novel, it is in fact what happened to me on the early morning hours of April 28th, 2020. That was the day my mother died, yes, but it was also the morning after I had performed her death crossing rituals. I did not look death in the eye. Gwen did not raise a fool, after all, and I knew enough to be more respectful than that. Yet there was an energy, a strength of presence so palpable that I was jolted from sound sleep into immediate consciousness and straight-up clarity. Unlike the community bell, however, there was no tolling for this moment. The muted, slowed pace of my mother's breathing could not block out the uncanny stillness, a near stoppage of time, but I could feel with the greatest assurance that my mother and I were no longer alone in her hospice room. And I knew beyond the shadow of a doubt who had entered and why they had come. The breath I did not realize I was holding slowly escaped when they left after a brief visit, and I was glad that this time they did not come for me. Savor. One of the things that death does, in addition to universalizing human loss, is help you find unexpected friends. A recent conversation with my death buddy, Lauren, we found each other on Twitter, this is actually true, and bonded over losing our parents early in the COVID-19 pandemic. It revealed the ways that we see the dead after they are gone, and how those ways that we see the dead are largely unspoken. While on summer vacation in Paris, Lauren saw her dead father walking on a beach, or near Paris, his outside appearance. And what's more, her very agnostic, ultra-realistic husband saw him too. Not too long after she died, my mom visited my friend Michelle, who in turn brought me one of Gwen's favorite beverages, Fireball whiskey. Michelle did not know why she brought me Fireball specifically, and you can see that offering in the corner there. She just knew that that was the one she needed to bring specifically. For Gwen, being seen meant being reminded of the tastes she savored.
That's all right, that's all right, that's all right, that's all right. Since my soul got a seat up in the kingdom, that's all right. My mother, how you walking long, your feet may slip and your soul may Lord. Since my soul got seat up in a kingdom, that's all right, that's all right, that's all right, that's all right, that's all right. Since my soul got a seat up in the kingdom, that's all right. Hush, little baby, don't you cry, you know your mother been born to die. Since my soul got a seat up in a kingdom, that's all right.
Performing my mother's crossing rituals took me an entire day. The altar had already been made and prayed over shortly before my arrival at hospice. But there were other details in which to tend: gathering the herbs and necessary ingredients, selecting the texts, making the playlist, making invitations, setting up a Zoom. A pivotal part of the evening was the invitation to 3 sisters. I asked them to be with me in ritual and prayer for a little while. I asked 3 women because of how my dream the night before reminded me of the necessity of 4. One to represent each element: earth, the anchor; wind, the carrier; fire, the tether; and water, the seeker, and which correspond with directionally south, west, north, and east, or the 4 points of the crossroads. But as my grandmother reminded me in the dream, the 3 others were also there to help keep the lead ritualist, in this case me, rooted to this side. Yes, ritualizing the dying is its own painstaking life work, and being tethered is necessary. At 9:18 p.m. on April 27, 2020, we convened, as COVID-19 and distant would have it, via Zoom. Who knew that a virtual digital space would hold such timely and transformative potential? We all wore whites, unspoken, unbeknownst to each other until the Zoom screen revealed it. united in sacred ceremonial uniform that transcended tradition and time zones. We read all kinds of texts, the Bible, Dickens, my mother was a huge fan, Walker, Alice, that is, Howard Thurman, Tony Cade, Somonfu Some, The Keeper of Ritual, of course must be read. We sang songs, that's all right, that's all right, that's all right, it'll be all right. We prayed. I prepared my mother's body with a mint bath and ivory soap, her favorite. I applied a petroleum salve infused with lavender to soften the hard places and to help her breathe easy. I spoke to her, whispers of safe journey. There are other things that shall not be spoken aloud. Near the end of the evening that had turned to morning, as we sat mostly in silence, one of my sisters spoke and said, you know, I quote, Miss Gwen is going to be an active ancestor, I can already tell. She continued, there are some for whom death gives them the freedom to do more. Miss Gwen is going to be more active on the other side than she was on this one. I already know it. Her comment immediately resonated with me. It made so much sense to think of my mother as being freed up in death from barriers that would prevent her from doing more for me, for my brother and her grandchildren and great-grandchildren. My mother, Gwen, in death became the epitome of what Toni Morrison describes as life otherwise. I have just read vignettes from my in-progress text, Black Crossroads. Morning Rituals, let me just go to that screen so you can see the title. Morning Rituals and Geographies of Sacred Space. In Black Crossroads, I speak to the necessity of ritual, the physical practices, the traditions, the customs we intentionally perform to navigate uncertainty and make meaning. I contend that we can only fully attend to the contours of Black mourning by responding with the appropriate grieving rituals. Black Crossroads, I have been writing a template of sorts for understanding and applying the practices, the songs, the performances, the traditions that govern the ways we attend to our dying, we care for our dead, and process our grief. That includes practices such as burning sage and creating ancestral altars and the use of medicinal herbs and oils to soften calloused skin. It also incorporates the peppermint and lavender-based salves designed to open breathing passages while easing transition into death. Black Crossroads underscores the ways these long-standing practices loom large in the Black imaginary, with comparative attention to how they're enacted in two Black cultures, my hometown of Moncks Corner, South Carolina, and on the island of Anguilla in British West Indies. It catalogs Black diasporic religious customs and brings attention to the sacred geographic space where these rituals have been held and should take place, the crossroads. So it builds on my longstanding work in the spaces between the living and the dead, exemplified in Talking to the Dead, which Melvin read, as well as my film, Death, Everything, Nothing. So it's an ethnographic study, but it's also deeply personal, as you all could hear, and tied to the morning rituals I performed years ago when my mother lay on her deathbed in a South Carolina hospice facility. I initially struggled with how to navigate such a deeply mournful moment. And as I described above, I eventually drew from the practices I learned as a child, as a student of religious studies, and from ancestral encounter to enact crossing rituals. So Black Crossroads is really a larger exploration of the ways we live with Black mourning and the inevitability of death. Like those works that I've previously done, it's also a foray into the power of ritual to help us navigate the unsettling weight of death. It's an excursus into ritual practice that has sustained and continues to sustain generations of Black folks as they mourn. And I like to think of it as a ritual roadmap, really, drawn from communities that have imbued sacred meaning and given that meaning to the geographic spaces where they grapple with Black collective grief. And then lastly, I would just say that Black Crossroads is really rooted in my desire to better understand mourning and accompanying rituals within our communities. But I think it's also poised, when I finish it, to do more than that, right? To really consider the ways that sacred rituals divined at the literal, at the metaphysical, and metaphorical spaces that Black folks survive and pursue wellness in the midst of profound loss, those crossroads spaces. It's an exploration into how these spaces are sacred hush harbors for Black communities and Black women in particular. And I'm hoping that it'll be a primer that can be used in practice, a manual of sorts, to help individuals and communities who are comforting the painful realities of death and dying. I've organized the text in its current formation in the ways that I began: salve, to think about touch, I've organized it by the senses, to think about the ways that touch soothes, embrace, how we caress, the ointments that facilitate embodied preparation, all that heals grief's fissures. Sound, the words we speak, those of comfort, our goodbyes, our last rites, benedictions, incantations, the soundtrack that undergirds our ritual, that prompts our memories and invokes an array of emotion from laughter to lament, the songs we sing in ritual, our wails. Scent, hospital sterility, the smell of death when the body releases, lavender, mint, aromas that invoked meaning and nostalgia, including Newport cigarettes, right? Sight, all that we use in our earthly and metaphysical eyes to see, including encounters with death that are difficult to unsee. And savor, water, honey, fruit, balm, bitterness, repast, all of the things that we taste. In the end, it's my hope that Black Crossroads, which you got to hear a little bit about from today, will become an important memorializing prompt to remind us that amidst uncertainty, and there's a lot of that, we must turn to the sacred places where rituals are enacted and where mourning takes place at the dimming eve of dusk, under the cover of night, and just before the pink-hued breakings of dawn. I believe it is time to return to the sacred practices governed by the geographic space of the Crossroads. Thank you.
Thank you both. That was amazing. I'm touched, moved by your presentations, and it reminds me of the power of bringing the deeply personal into the work that we do, whether those are family histories, our intimate connections with music making, and rather than pose a question, I know that I'm sure there are lots of questions in the audience, and I want to be respectful of our time. Let me just throw out some keywords that emerged for me. Well, I'll make one other comment in addition, but some keywords that emerged from me, and you are the panelists, you're welcome to respond to this, or we'll see if there are questions. Orbit, circle, the idea of coming full circle, or returning. Sounds of the ancestors, bringing the past into the present, sonic intimacy, unsettled and uncanny. I think I'm most struck, though, by the ways in which you both have paid homage to ancestors in different ways. And I'm thinking about a recent talk I heard you give, Michael Veal, where you talked about your father, who was a microbiologist but also a drummer, who was very committed to playing drums and committed to playing that ride cymbal in a way that one hit of that cymbal, one tone, one sound could transform a room, could evoke a kind of power in the spirit of someone like Art Blakey, another ancestor of sorts. So if there were a question here, maybe it's just about this intimacy and the idea of coming full circle and the ways in which, for both of you, the personal intersects with or comes around to your scholarly work. And I don't know if that's something we have time to answer here because I'm looking at the time and I want to make sure we have time for a break. But that's my opening comment. Would you like to comment on that? And in the meantime, think about questions that you all have in the audience as well.
Sure, I can start us off. I kind of feel like we have approached in our papers the same thing from different directions. Having to do with transitions and portals and how energies are manipulated to open new experiences of consciousness or close them. And so transitions, crossroads, for example, what I said about the symmetric harmonies, that is a crossroads of sorts. It's something that, it's a point of decision and a point of departure that can be used to continuously redirect consciousness. So, and then ending, talking about using those types of harmonies, a person using them to create a portal for themselves to transition into the next world, whatever that is or is not, I think is another link between our two papers.
Yeah, I would just add to that, in terms of, one of the things that really resonates between, I would say, among us, is your emphasis on Coltrane's, kind of directing our attention elsewhere, right? I think you used the phrase directing our attention upwards. And so much of my thinking and writing and musing of late has been really around the metaphysical, translating metaphysical experiences in a way that is legible, with full understanding that sometimes it cannot be, right? And it's not meant to be legible or even translatable. But I do think, there are these spaces betwixt and between that can hold those elements. And, it is about kind of redirecting energy. And sometimes that's, upward, sometimes that's elsewhere. And so I'm really just, fascinated and pleased about that synergy in particular.
I guess I would just add one thing to that. There is all this talk about harmonies and symmetric harmonies and departures from traditional harmony. There's a book by an ethnomusicologist named Stephen Feld, and it's called Jazz Cosmopolitanism in Accra, Ghana. And in that book, Feld interviews a Ghanaian musician who plays indigenous Ghanaian wind instruments, but he's a devotee of John Coltrane. It's a very fascinating chapter in the book. And in that chapter, this musician, whose name is Ni Norte, says, well, I understand that Coltrane is trained in the Western system, but what I hear in his pitch choices are submerged African languages trying to manifest in his choice of pitches. And he says, even though Coltrane couldn't speak the African languages, they're part of his, they're marbled within his consciousness, and he's trying to bring them to into audibility using the implements of the Western musical scale, the Western pitch system. So there's something there too, I think we could explore.
Now we have a few hands. I see a hand over there. Todd? Do we have a microphone over there for you?
Okay. All right. How about now? Great.
Yeah.
Thank you for these enlivening presentations. I'm thinking a bit about the scholar performer, and this includes you, Melvin, and the scholar practitioner, and that also as a place where your presentations kind of align, right? The social location of you as scholars and performers and practitioners. And I'm thinking out loud here, but I was struck by Christina Sharp's Ordinary Notes and finding out that someone whose kind of claim to fame as wake work is the descendant of mediums. Did anybody catch that in Ordinary Notes? Her mother and her grandparents were powerful mediums, right? And I wanted, like, the religion scholar in me was like, please, please, please talk more, right? About the fact that some people are called to do death work, right? That it's actually a spiritual calling. And so I'm thinking a bit about Rhon, your work more directly, but even Michael, your work as well. Like, how does performance, how does practice help you theorize your work, right? In communicating with the dead, or Crossroads methods in particular, right? But I remember for me, just reading that book, I was like, oh my gosh, of course, right? Of course there's a genealogical story to Sharp's work, right, that I would have loved to see her lean into. And what does, like, how does Coltrane speak to you, Michael, right? The scholarly side of you, how does he speak to you and through you as a performer, right? Rhon, obviously your mom is very present and speaking to you. How is she the theorist in this work for you? How are you both mediums for these crossroads?
I would just say that what we're doing in this room is intellectual and scholarly, but it's actually multidimensional. And we call it scholarly because we're sitting in this room doing it. But it could be political, it could be spiritual. There are all kinds of energies marbled in and interpenetrating what we're doing in this room. And if we were doing it on a stage somewhere in a performance setting, it would be scholarly and intellectual in that context. not to mention curative, psychotherapeutic, blah, 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 you know. So it's all multidimensional. That's my short answer to your question. We're masquerading in this room as intellectuals and scholars, but in fact, we're prismatic, multidimensional human beings vibrating on a number of simultaneous frequencies and pursuing a number of simultaneous priorities, which in this room, we designate scholarly and intellectual.
Yeah, I would just, if I can just riff off that and in response, I mean, I would say that, you know, part of the ability to operate in any kind of multidimensional sense has everything to do with one's ability to yield to it, right? To make room for it. And ideally, to make room for it in places where it might not necessarily on the surface make sense to make room for it. Zoom, right? You know, is as one, you know, kind of contemporary example. But yeah, I think that, you know, to answer your question, Todney, you know, for me, the work has very much turned to a reminder about the necessity of making room and using all of my abilities and skills to actually do everything that I can to facilitate those connections between, among the living and the dead, et cetera. So yeah, when I talk about I inherited a cemetery because my aunt saw my name on the back of a land deed, you know, and it signaled to her that I was meant to be a caretaker. In that moment, I remember getting that call, and she was like, I think you're supposed to take care of this cemetery. And I was like, I live hundreds and hundreds of miles away. But, you know, and so that was my initial response. My initial response was very pragmatic, was very functional, was very like, you know, okay, what do you want me to do with this? But that soon gave way, and my other kind of response to that giving way has everything to do with who one surrounds oneself with and how they also help them make room, if that makes sense. So I raise that caveat just to say that, you know, my husband was like, this is a non-start, like, of course. If she's saying that you are meant to be the caretaker, then we must figure out how you caretake, right? And so that also, I think, becomes an important element too, that Michael is certainly taking up and engaging. Like, this isn't happening alone, right? It's, you know, even if it's in solitudinous moments, it's happening in community and it's happening, and that's that vibrational exchange, right? Yeah.
So it's 11:03. I want to make sure we have time for a break, but let's maybe take a couple of more and questions.
The title of this Q&A session might be Post-Tenure Confessions. Nobody's going to say this early stage in their career.
I see a hand here, and then we'll go. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Ivor Miller. I'm responding to Professor Veal's images. And I just wanted to point out that in my conversations with Cuban musicians who are initiates of Congo, Carabali, Lukumi systems, there's a deep conversation between the sacred signatures, the firmas, which are often based on a circle, like the astrological chart and the tone chart that you showed. And so that's something that I learned about from my Cuban friends, which comes out of the sacred writing of West Africa, that is very important to their use of music and what they play. The sign goes with the sound. So I was just struck by that. And I think a good example, a living player is David Vireyes, who's a great pianist you probably know, and who does a lot of graphic arts based on those signs. So I just wanted to throw that out. Thank you for your talk.
No, thank you. It's a beautiful, beautiful connection.
Professor Matori, yeah.
Thank you both. Really great talks. They evoked in me, however, attention, and I don't know whether this is related to the particular sections of your works that you read that had different foci, or an actual difference of philosophy that we're talking about between Coltrane on the one hand and ancestrality on the other. Professor Veal, I was hearing in your reading of Coltrane an intense impulse toward the disruption of the steady rhythms of intergenerational reproduction and ancestrality, and a transcendence that reflected Christians' deep ambivalence about ancestrality. The idea that, the metaphor of, when you leave your mother and your father when you marry, and you're marrying your partner, but Christianity is also a marriage to Christ. So you're leaving ancestry behind and moving skyward, as opposed to the earthward orientation of identifying with and keeping alive your ancestors. So I wonder, again, was Coltrane, again, the inveterate modernist, the transcendent, or did he have in him also the spirit of keeping the ancestor alive as he constantly disrupted rhythm?
I think they're not mutually exclusive priorities. I think they coexist in his life and in his consciousness and in his art. That's why I related the anecdote about the Ghanaian saxophonist who heard submerged African languages. There was a whole discourse in the 1960s around free jazz and experimental jazz that what these players were actually manifesting was a kind of Swahili-like Pan-African, not Pan-African in the political sense of the term, but as in pan-cultural African language that the slaves had used, that they had devised to communicate among each other, that had gotten kind of beaten down into the African-American consciousness as a result of slavery and the successive generations of oppression and the destruction of African cultural practices in the U.S. So it wasn't only John Coltrane. I would say in the 1960s, which of course, those decades following World War II were the decades of the eruption of African consciousness among African Americans after that having been suppressed for literally centuries. Your work and my work, for example, is a manifestation of that impulse. And so a lot of people heard the arcane harmonic pitch operations of jazz as actually a manifestation of these submerged conceptual Africanisms that finally were breaking through in the context of the liberation movements of the 1960s. And so I don't know if that answers your question, because it's a complex question that will require several complex answers. But it's all in there together, it's all about breaking through and creating a space. So I guess the simple answer would be they're not mutually exclusive, and Coltrane was manifesting stuff that pre-existed him. But at the same time, just like I said about the scholars in this room, he was a modernist working in dialogue with Igor Stravinsky, Olivier Messiaen, and Claude Debussy, and everyone on down the line. He was both.
All right, Dr. Manigault-Bryant, any final thoughts from you or anything before we dismiss? If not, it's fine too. I just wanted to.
No.
Okay, all right. Well, this has been fantastic. We have, I think, time for a short break before we do that and continue the proceedings. Let's give both of our presenters a nice round of applause.